Brian Hooker says his wife vanished in a tragic accident at sea. But more than a month later, the boat he shared with her is no longer just a sailboat. It is now in the custody of the United States Coast Guard. Right now in Fort Pierce, Florida, sitting behind a Coast Guard station, there is a sailboat named Soulmate. From the road, you can barely see it. From nearby properties, you might only catch the top of the mast. And because this is a secured Coast Guard facility, you can simply fly a drone over it to get a closer look. So the only way to really see it is from the water. And once you get close enough, the story begins to feel very different. Because Soulmate was not just a vessel, it was Brian and Lynette Hooker's home. It was where they lived, where they traveled, and where their life together on the water was supposed to continue. But on the night of April 4th, near Hopetown in the Bahamas, everything changed. According to Brian Hooker, he and Lynette were riding in a small dinghy. When the weather turned rough, he says Lynette fell overboard. He says she had the ignition key connected to the motor's kill switch. And once she went into the water, the engine stopped. Brian says he tried to reach her. He says the wind and current pushed them apart. He says he could not get the dinghy started again. And by the time he finally reached help, Lynette was gone. She has not been seen since. But now, investigators are not only looking at what happened in that dinghy, they are looking at the sailboat itself. That is what makes this case so important. If Lynette simply fell into the water during a horrible accident, then Soulmate may have very little to say. But if something happened before they ever got into that dinghy, if there was an argument, if there was a struggle, if the timeline does not match the physical evidence, then that boat may be one of the last places where the truth still exists. And that raises the questions at the center of this case. Why did the Coast Guard seize Brian Hooker's sailboat? What do investigators believe may still be on board? Why is the United States involved in a disappearance that happened in the Bahamas? And perhaps most importantly, if Lynette Hooker can no longer tell us what happened that night, can Soulmate tell the story for her? To understand why investigators are now treating Soulmate like potential evidence, you first have to understand the story. Brian Hooker told authorities the night Lynette disappeared. According to Brian, everything began on the evening of April 4th near Hopetown in the Bahamas. At some point around 7:30 that night, he and Lynette left shore in a very small dinghy, not a large boat, not something designed for rough offshore conditions, just a compact dinghy with a small electric outboard motor. Brian says the weather was getting bad. The wind was strong, the water was rough, and then, according to his account, Lynette fell overboard. But one detail in Brian's story immediately became important to investigators: the ignition key. The dinghy they were using reportedly had a kill switch system attached to the motor, similar to what you see on jet skis or small personal watercraft. The operator wears a lanyard connected to the ignition. If the person attached to it falls into the water, the engine shuts off automatically. Brian says Lynette had that key attached to her when she went overboard, meaning the moment she hit the water, the engine died. And according to Brian, without that key, he could not restart the motor. What happened next is where the timeline becomes difficult to piece together. Brian says he tried to save her. He says the wind and current pushed them apart in the darkness. He says the small dinghy was being blown around in the rough conditions, leaving him unable to get back to her. Hours later, sometime around 4 in the morning, Brian finally arrived in Marsh Harbor and reported Lynette missing. By then, nearly 8 hours had passed. Search efforts began almost immediately. Authorities in the Bahamas searched the area. People familiar with the waters near Hopetown tried to make sense of the conditions that night. And while nobody disputes that the ocean can become deadly very quickly, especially after dark, questions started forming almost immediately around Brian's version of events. How severe was the weather really? Could the dinghy have drifted that far? Would an experienced boater have gone out in those conditions in such a small vessel? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly happened during those missing hours between Lynette going overboard and Brian finally reaching help? At first, investigators in the Bahamas focused on this as a missing persons case at sea. But very quickly, the situation became more serious. Brian Hooker was taken into custody for questioning. For several days, authorities held him while they investigated what happened that night. And even though he was eventually released without charges, the questions surrounding the case did not disappear. In fact, they only grew larger, because while Brian continued insisting this was a tragic accident, Lynette's family began publicly saying they believed there was more to the story. At this point, There is still no public evidence proving Brian Hooker harmed his wife, and it's important to say that clearly he has not been charged with a crime. He has denied any wrongdoing, and officially, Lynette Hooker is still considered a missing person. But as more details about the case became public, Lynette's family began openly questioning whether Brian's story made sense, and the deeper people looked into the timeline, the more unsettling certain details became. One of the first concerns involved the weather. Brian described the conditions that night as dangerous strong winds, rough water, poor visibility. According to him, the weather played a major role in Lynette's disappearance and prevented him from reaching her after she fell overboard. But some experienced boaters familiar with the area reportedly questioned whether conditions were truly severe enough to fully explain what happened. Not necessarily calm, but perhaps not catastrophic either. And that distinction matters, because the second major question centered around the dinghy itself. Photos of the vessel show an extremely small dinghy with a modest electric motor, the kind many people would consider suitable mainly for short trips in sheltered waters, not for traveling in heavy wind after dark. That immediately raised another uncomfortable question. Brian Hooker was not a first-time boater. He and Lynette had been living aboard Soulmate. They traveled extensively by water, which means Brian likely understood the risks better than most people would. So why go out in those conditions at all? Was it simply overconfidence? A terrible decision made by someone experienced enough to think he could handle it? Or was something else happening that night? Then there's the timeline itself. According to the known sequence of events, Lynette reportedly disappeared sometime around 7:30 that evening. But Brian did not reach Marsh Harbor until roughly 4 a.m. That leaves a gap of nearly 8 hours, and in investigations like this, unexplained time becomes extremely important. Investigators would naturally want to know, where exactly was the dinghy during those hours? How far could it realistically drift? What were the currents doing? What attempts were made to call for help? What physical evidence supports the timeline Brian described? And then's what happened after Brian reached shore. Authorities in the Bahamas detained him for several days while questioning him about Lynette's disappearance. Reports indicate he was held until officials either needed evidence to formally charge him or legally had to release him. Eventually, they let him go, but for Lynette's family, that was not the end of the story. In some ways, it was the beginning. Because after Brian was released, he reportedly said he wanted to remain in the Bahamas to continue searching for his wife. But not long afterward, he left. According to statements connected to him, he returned to deal with family matters involving his mother's health. Still, for Lynette's family, his departure felt wrong, and nobody expressed that pain more publicly than Lynette's daughter. In emotional social media videos and interviews, she questioned whether her mother's disappearance was really just a boating accident. She described the heartbreak of birthdays and Mother's Day arriving without answers, without closure, and without even knowing where her mother truly disappeared. For the family, this is no longer just about an accident at sea. It's about uncertainty. It's about the feeling that something in the story does not fully connect. And now, with federal investigators seizing Soulmate itself, many people are wondering if authorities may feel the same way. Because when investigators take possession of a boat like this, they usually believe it may still have something important to say. More than a month after Lynette Hooker disappeared, investigators made a move that changed the entire direction of the case. The United States Coast Guard seized Soulmate, not searched, not photographed, seized, and that distinction matters. Because when federal investigators take control of a vessel during an active investigation, it usually means they believe the boat itself may contain evidence that still needs to be preserved, examined, or re-examined. Right now, Soulmate is sitting inside a Coast Guard station in Fort Pierce, Florida. And according to investigators and sources connected to the case, there is still an active criminal investigation underway. That doesn't automatically mean a crime occurred. But it does mean authorities believe the circumstances surrounding Lynette's disappearance require a much deeper level of scrutiny than a standard accident investigation. So what exactly could investigators be looking for on the boat? The answer is potentially almost everything. A sailboat is more than transportation. For Brian and Lynette Hooker, it was their home. It was the place where they spent their days, stored their belongings, communicated with each other, planned routes, and lived their lives together in close quarters. Which means if something happened before they ever stepped into that dinghy, traces of it could still exist aboard Soulmate. Investigators could be examining Damage inside the vessel, signs of a struggle, clothing, personal belongings, electronic devices, navigation records, phone data, messages, photos, video recordings, even tiny physical details that might help establish whether Brian's timeline matches the physical evidence left behind. And despite the amount of time that has passed, investigators may still believe the boat contains valuable forensic evidence, especially if it has remained largely untouched since Lynette disappeared. A retired Coast Guard investigator interviewed about the case explained that preserving the vessel is critical because investigators often need to revisit evidence repeatedly as new leads develop. In other words, the boat becomes a controlled scene, a place investigators can return to whenever new questions emerge. Because cases like this are rarely solved through one dramatic discovery, they are built piece by piece. One inconsistency, one timeline discrepancy, one digital record, one physical detail investigators can either confirm or disprove. And there's another important reason authorities may want to preserve the vessel. If criminal charges were ever filed in the future, the defense would also need access to the same evidence investigators examine. Keeping the boat secured ensures that every side can later review the exact same scene under controlled conditions. But perhaps the most unsettling part of all this is what the seizure itself implies. Investigators are no longer focused only on what happened in the water. They are also looking at what may have happened before Lynette ever disappeared into the ocean. Because if this were simply a tragic accident caused entirely by rough seas and bad luck, there may have been little reason to take possession of the entire sailboat weeks later. Yet that is exactly what happened. And the deeper this investigation goes, the more one question continues hanging over the entire case. What do investigators believe they might still find aboard Soulmate? One of the most confusing parts of this case is the location, because Lynette Hooker did not disappear in U.S. waters. According to Brian Hooker's account, everything happened near Hopetown in the Bahamas. So naturally, many people began asking the same question. If this happened in another country, why is the United States Coast Guard now leading such a significant part of the investigation? The answer comes down to jurisdiction. According to a retired Coast Guard investigator familiar with cases like this, vessels registered in the United States or operating under the U.S. flag can still fall under American jurisdiction even when they are outside U.S. waters. And Soulmate was reportedly a U.S. registered vessel. That changes everything, because from an investigative standpoint, the disappearance of an American citizen connected to an American vessel can immediately bring federal agencies into the picture, especially when the circumstances surrounding the disappearance remain unclear. And contrary to what many people assume, the Coast Guard is not simply a rescue organization. It also has a federal investigative branch known as CGS, the Coast Guard Investigative Service. These are federal agents, and in cases involving possible criminal activity at sea, CGS can work alongside other agencies, including the FBI. That means this case may no longer be viewed purely as a maritime accident. Investigators could now be examining whether there are inconsistencies, missing evidence, or facts that require a criminal investigation, rather than only a search and rescue response. At the same time, the Bahamas still plays an important role because the incident itself reportedly occurred within Bahamian territory. So what may be happening behind the scenes is a coordinated investigation involving multiple jurisdictions. The Bahamas handled the initial response. They detained Brian Hooker for questioning. They collected early evidence. But once Soulmate returned to the United States, American authorities now had direct access to the vessel itself. And that gave them an opportunity to conduct a much more extensive forensic review under U.S. control. According to the former Coast Guard investigator interviewed in the case, agencies may already have collected electronic evidence such as phones, tablets, and digital recordings during earlier searches. Now, with the boat secured in Florida, investigators can continue analyzing the vessel as new information develops. And that matters because investigations like this often evolve slowly. Sometimes evidence that appears meaningless at first becomes important only after another piece of the puzzle is uncovered. A timestamp, a damaged object, a deleted message, a route that does align with a statement. That is why preserving the vessel is so important. Not because investigators necessarily know a crime occurred, but because they may believe the answers have not yet fully surfaced. And there is one more detail making this investigation even more interesting. Just days before the seizure of Soulmate became public, the Coast Guard released photos of another sailboat they were trying to identify. Investigators believe the people aboard that vessel may have seen something important, which means somewhere out there, another witness may exist. Someone who could potentially confirm or challenge Brian Hooker's version of events. At the center of this entire investigation are three critical questions. Questions that may ultimately determine whether Lynette Hooker's disappearance was a tragic accident or something far more disturbing. And right now, investigators may be using every piece of evidence aboard Soulmate to try to answer them. Question 1. Did Lynette really fall from the dinghy the way Brian described? On the surface, Brian Hooker's explanation is possible. The dinghy was extremely small. The weather may have been rough. The incident reportedly happened at night. And according to maritime experts familiar with small vessels, a lightweight dinghy with a weak electric motor could easily struggle in heavy wind and current, especially after the engine shuts off. The retired Coast Guard investigator interviewed about the case even acknowledged that under certain conditions, two people in a tiny dinghy could realistically become separated very quickly in the dark. But investigators are not trying to determine whether the story is possible. They are trying to determine whether the physical evidence supports it. That means looking at details such as, how strong were the winds exactly? What direction were the currents moving? How far could the dinghy realistically drift? Could Brian have restarted the motor? Would the kill switch have functioned exactly the way he described? How long would someone in Lynette's position realistically survive in the water? And perhaps most importantly, does every part of Brian's account remain consistent over time? Because in cases like this, investigators often focus less on dramatic moments and more on small inconsistencies, tiny details that slowly stop fitting together. And one detail investigators may pay particular attention to is the ignition key itself. Because according to Brian, that key explains why he could not maneuver the dinghy back toward Lynette after she fell overboard, which means that one single object may now sit at the center of the entire timeline. Question 2. Did something happen aboard Soulmate before they ever entered the dinghy? This may be the most important reason investigators seized the sailboat itself. Because if Lynette's disappearance truly began in the water, the sailboat may reveal very little. But if events leading up to her disappearance started aboard Soulmate, then the vessel becomes critically important. Investigators may now be examining whether there is any evidence of conflict before the couple left the boat that evening. Not speculation, not rumors, actual evidence, signs of damage, disturbed areas inside the cabin, blood traces, broken objects, digital communication, deleted messages, anything capable of establishing the emotional and physical state of the couple before Lynette vanished. And in many modern investigations, digital evidence becomes just as important as physical evidence. Phone activity, GPS routes, timestamps, messages sent or messages that suddenly stopped. Even small electronic clues can sometimes reveal whether a timeline truly makes sense. That's why preserving Soulmate matters so much, because unlike witness memories, physical evidence does not become emotional. It either supports the story or it does. Question 3. Who was on the mystery sailboat the Coast Guard wants to identify? This may end up being one of the most overlooked details in the entire case. The Coast Guard publicly released photos of another sailboat they were attempting to identify, saying the people aboard may have information relevant to the investigation. That immediately raised a major possibility. What if someone else saw Brian and Lynette that night? What if another vessel observed the dinghy or noticed something unusual before Lynette disappeared? Right now, much of the known timeline comes primarily from Brian Hooker's account, but an independent witness could potentially change everything. A sighting, a timestamp, a conversation, a light seen on the water, even a seemingly insignificant observation could either reinforce Brian's story or completely challenge it. And in investigations where only one person returns to tell the story, independent witnesses become incredibly important. Because sometimes the difference between an accident and a criminal investigation comes down to one person seeing something nobody else did. And right now, investigators appear to believe someone out there may know more than they've said so far. Right now, there are still far more questions than answers in the disappearance of Lynette Hooker. No body has been found, no charges have been filed. And officially, Brian Hooker continues to maintain that this was a tragic accident at sea. But despite that, federal investigators now have possession of the sailboat he shared with his wife. And that alone says something important. Because investigators do not usually preserve a vessel like this unless they believe it may still contain evidence worth protecting. For Lynette's family, the hardest part may not simply be the loss itself, it is the uncertainty. The fact that there is no final explanation, no confirmed timeline, no clear understanding of what truly happened during those hours on the water near Hopetown. Only one version of events exists publicly, and investigators appear to still be testing whether that version fully matches the evidence. At this point, there are really only a few possibilities. This could have been a terrible accident caused by darkness, wind, and a tiny dinghy overwhelmed by rough conditions. It could have involved dangerous decisions made by experienced boaters who underestimated the ocean, or something else may have happened before Lynette ever entered the water. That is exactly what investigators are now trying to determine. And the deeper you look into the case, the more symbolic the sailboat itself becomes. Because Soulmate was once the center of Brian and Lynette's life together. It was home, it represented freedom, travel, and a future on the water. Now it sits behind a Coast Guard station, sealed off as part of an active investigation. The same boat that once carried them through the Bahamas may now be holding the final physical clues connected to Lynette's disappearance. A timeline, a digital record, a damaged object, a detail investigators missed the first time, or perhaps nothing at all. But until investigators finish examining every possibility, Soulmate remains far more than just a sailboat. It is now a potential witness. And maybe the most haunting part of this entire case is that Lynette Hooker can no longer tell investigators what happened that night. So now authorities are left searching for answers in everything she left behind. The water, the timeline, the electronic records, the witness accounts, and the boat itself. Because if the truth still exists somewhere in this case, investigators may believe part of it is still sitting aboard Soulmate.